Good morning. We're going to talk about ecosystem and global ecology today. This is chapter 53 from the Freeman textbook. And we're going to start off by thinking a little bit like an ecosystem ecologist. What are some questions that an ecosystem ecologist might ask? So first of all, tropical forests are dense and tall, but why do they only accumulate a small layer of organic material? Why does tundra support an abundance of soil organic matter? What causes the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere to increase in the winter? Where does fertilizer nitrogen go if not into crops? How have invasive species altered fire frequencies and why? And why are methane and ice caps and human population correlated? So these are just some of the questions. You can see these are really big questions that have to do with fluxes of materials and nutrients, oftentimes at the scale of a larger scale, continental scale, ecosystem scale, things like that. So ecosystem processes typically involve the transfer of energy from one pool to another, or the transfer of nutrients or materials. So things like photosynthesis, so bringing CO2 from the atmosphere into plant biomass and then making that plant biomass available for other trophic levels. Combustion and respiration, so turning biomass into carbon dioxide. The weathering of rocks, releasing important nutrients and minerals, things like phosphorus, into the ecosystem. The evaporation of water, both from surface waters, but also from plants. The dissolution of materials into water, the absorption of minerals by plants, and decomposition, all types of decomposition. So these are the kinds of things that ecosystem ecologists might study, and the questions that they might ask would relate to some of these processes. The last one, herbivory and consumption, forgot about that. Okay, so how big is an ecosystem? Well, it's something that can be measured at multiple scales, but typically at the larger scale. So you could think about the ecosystem of a very small rock, right? Or the ecosystem of a puddle. Those would be things at very small scales. But most of the time we're thinking at more of the landscape scale, things like forest ecosystems or watersheds, or maybe even all the way up to the whole globe. So which scale is most appropriate? Well, that really depends on your question. So something that I got asked a lot in my graduate studies was, what's your question? What's your research question? Because that will determine what scale you're working at and what things you might measure and what inference you can make about your research questions. So the scale that you might study these things depends on your question, but they could scale from the size of a millimeter all the way up to the size of the whole planet. There's also different temporal scales. So you could ask a question at kind of an instantaneous scale. So how does rain affect soil moisture? How does light affect photosynthesis? How does a predator affect prey? These would be happening on the scale of seconds to minutes. Or you could ask something at the scale of a season. So does production exceed herbivory in the summer? Does herbivory exceed production in the winter? What kinds of seasonal changes in ecosystem carbon balance might there be? Or you can ask something at a successional scale. How do plant communities change through time? And this would be over decades, up to about several hundred years. And you could watch a community of plants changing over time. You could think about migrational scale. So some organisms migrate yearly. Sometimes they have multiple yearly kind of rhythms, right? Like cicadas go through these mass cycles where they have high populations every 17 years. So some kind of migrational pattern or some other kind of pattern. So how do birds move nutrients across the continents through their migration patterns? You could ask a question at kind of an evolutionary history scale. So as species are kind of taking up space on the landscape, are they shrinking or expanding? Is there, some kind of evolutionary history? Are they showing adaptations to the environment? Are they moving or migrating? What's neat about aspen clones is that you can actually determine genetic differences based on their coloration in either the spring or the fall. So here you can see different clones and maybe how they might be adapting to their environment. And then you can ask questions at the geologic history scale. So how has carbon distribution changed between lands and oceans throughout geologic time? And these questions are really big. So ecosystem ecology, kind of similar to ecology in general, is a very interdisciplinary study. So it involves a lot of earth science and climatology and hydrology, a lot of soil science and geochemistry, along with some community ecology, population ecology, and physiology. And then, of course, there's always these ties into kind of social and ecological stewardship questions and sustainability. So one of the key factors in terms of ecosystem ecology is trying to ask how productive are different ecosystems. And productivity depends on a few things. It depends on total incoming solar energy. Then it depends on how much of that energy can be translated into green plant growth. And so plants take up that solar energy, they take up CO2, and they produce biomass. Their gross primary productivity is basically how much of that work are they doing, but then they're respiring too. And so not all of that uptake goes into biomass. A lot of it is lost through cellular respiration. And so the total amount of chemical energy produced in a given area in a period of time is called gross primary productivity. But if you subtract off how much respiration occurs in that period of time, you're left with what's called net primary productivity, or NPP, which is about roughly 45% of GPP across the globe. Now, NPP then results in the green stuff, the biomass, that's then available to consumers and decomposers. And only, this is kind of crazy, but only 0.8%, not 8%, but 0.8% of sunlight that comes to Earth is actually captured by plants and then turned into biomass, which is a very small amount. So why are plants so inefficient at this? Well, first of all, the photopigments that they have in their bodies can only capture a fraction of the available light that's coming into them. The second is that photosynthesis doesn't occur at this really high rate all year. So because a lot of species are deciduous and drop their leaves, photosynthesis drops considerably in the wintertime. The other is that photosynthesis is very slow in very hot and dry environments when plants are trying to save water. So they stop photosynthesizing or they slow it down quite a lot. And the last is that the efficiency of these photosynthetic enzymes is temperature dependent. And so happens at different rates depending on the temperature. So here you can see a graph showing basically the sunlight coming in. So it arrives as light and then it exits the system as heat at each step. The sunlight comes in, primary producers build biomass, and then they carry it up to primary consumers. Some heat is lost. Secondary consumers, some heat is lost. And tertiary consumers, some heat is lost. And at each of these steps, there are nutrients that are cycling through the ecosystem as well. So energy, this kind of chemical energy that came from light and the transfer of light into chemical energy, it's lost a little bit at each cycle. And we're going to talk about that some more after the break. So take a 10-minute break and come back to the next lecture.